where in his famous formulation, everyone knows how to rule and be ruled in turn. It is this reflection on the character of the citizen that leads him to wonder whether the good citizen and the good human being are one and the same. Can a person be both, as it were, a good man, a good person, and a good citizen? Famous discussion in Aristotle's book. Aristotle's answer to this is perhaps deliberately obscure. The good citizen, he tells us, is still relative to the regime. That is to say, the good citizen of a democracy will not necessarily be the same person or the same kind of person as the good citizen of a monarchy or an aristocracy. Citizen virtue is relative, or we might say regime relative. Only in the best regime, he says, will the good citizen and the good human being be the same. But what is the best regime? At least at this point, he has not told us. The point he's trying to make is there are several kinds of regimes and therefore several kinds of citizenship appropriate to them. Each regime is constituted by its matter, that is to say, by its citizen body, as we've been talking about, but also now by its form, by its formal structures. That is to say, every regime will also be a set of institutions and formal structures that give shape to its citizens. Regimes or constitutions, you might say, are forms or formalities that determine how power is shared and distributed among citizens. Every regime is an answer, consciously or not, to the oldest political question of all: who governs? Who should govern? Every regime is an answer to that question because every regime sets forward a way of formally distributing powers and distributing offices among its citizen body. So we move now from the matter of the regime, it's what constitutes its citizens and its citizen body, to the question of the form of the regime, its forms, its formalities, its structures and institutions, you might say. Entirely too much of modern political science is focused on simply the forms and formalities of political life, not enough, in my opinion, with questions of the citizen body and what constitutes the character or the virtue, in Aristotle's term, of its citizens. But nevertheless, Aristotle gives extraordinary importance and attention to the forms or formalities that make up a regime. What does he mean by that? Aristotle defines the strictly formal criteria of apoliteia twice in his Politics. And I'm sure you noted both times where they appeared, yes? Book 3, Chapter 6, famous definition. The regime, he says, is an arrangement of a city with respect to its offices, particularly the one who has the authority over all matters. For what has authority in the city is everywhere the governing body, and the governing body is the regime. The regime is an arrangement of a city, he says, with respect to its offices, and every city will have a governing body, that governing body being the regime. The second definition appears at the beginning of Book 4, Chapter 1. For a regime, he writes, is an arrangement in cities connected with offices, establishing the manner in which they have been distributed, what the authoritative element of the regime is, and what the end of the partnership is in each case. A similar but slightly different definition of what constitutes the formal structure of regime politics. But from these two definitions, appearing in Book 3, Chapter 6, and Book 4, Chapter 1, we learn a number of important things. First, just to repeat, A regime concerns the manner in which power is divided or distributed in a community. This is what Aristotle means when he uses the phrase, an arrangement of a city with respect to its offices. In other words, every regime will be based on some kind of judgment of how power should be distributed, to the one, to the few, or the many, to use the Aristotelian categories of political rule, or some mixture, some mixture of those three classes that constitute every city. In every regime, one of these groups, he says, will be the dominant class, will be the dominant body, the ruling body, as he says in that definition. And that ruling body will, in turn, he says, define the nature of the regime. But Aristotle tells us something more than this. His regime typology, is to say his division of power, his division of regimes into the rule of the one, the few, and the many, is based not only on how powers are distributed in a purely factual way, he also distinguishes between regimes that are well-ordered, well-governed, and those that are corrupt. Those that are corrupt. What does he mean in terms of this distinction? Aristotle's distinction seems to be not only empirical, again, based on the factual distribution of powers. It seems to have what we might call today a normative component to it. It makes a distinction or a judgment between the well-ordered and the deviant regimes, the corrupt regimes. On the one side, he tells us the well-ordered regimes are monarchy, aristocracy, and what he calls polity, rule of the one, the few, and the many. And on the corrupt side, he describes them as tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, also ruled by the one, the few, and the many. But what criteria, we want to know, does he use to distinguish between these, as it were, sixfold classification of regimes? How does he distinguish the well-ordered regimes from the corrupt regimes? And here is where Aristotle's analysis gets, in some ways, maddeningly tricky. Because in many ways of his general reluctance to condemn any regime out of hand. If you were to read more than I had assigned for you in class, if you were to read through all of Book 6, for example, you would find Aristotle not only giving advice to democrats, democracies, and other regimes on how to preserve themselves. You would find a lengthy description of how tyrants should moderate, or how tyrants learn to preserve and defend their own regime. It seems almost as if living before the incarnation of pure evil in the 20th century, with the rise of modern totalitarianisms, that Aristotle seemed to think that no regime was so bad, no regime was so devoid of goodness, that its preservation was not worth at least some effort. Think of that. Rather, in many ways, he provides reasoned arguments for the strengths and weaknesses of several different regime types. Let's consider the one that's closest to our own, democracy. Let's consider what Aristotle has to tell us about that regime. In fact, it would be an interesting question for people to consider, to know how would Aristotle confront, or what would his analysis be of a regime like Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, the Iran of Khomeini, regimes that are clearly tyrannies, but do they even go beyond, in some way, the tyrannies that Aristotle spoke about? And what kind of advice, what would he have to say about them? In any way, let's think about democracy. Interestingly, we find Aristotle defending democracy on the grounds that it may contain collectively greater wisdom than a regime ruled by the one or the few. In Book 3, Chapter 11, for example, he writes, "For because they are many," that is to say the citizen body, the ruling body of a democracy, "each can have a part of virtue and prudence, and on their uniting together, and on their joining together," he says, "the multitude, with its many feet and hands, and having many senses, becomes," he writes, "like a single human being, and so also with respect to character and mind." Think of that. The people in a democracy, he says, coming together, uniting together, become like a single human being with many hands and feet, and he says, with greater character and mind. We even hear more than any single individual. And in the same text, we also hear Aristotle praising the practice of ostracism. That is to say, exiling, banishing those individuals deemed to be preeminent in any particular virtue or quality. And he makes a similar point in Book 3, Chapter 15, in describing the process of democratic deliberation as a superior means of arriving at decisions. He compares it to a potluck dinner. Any one of them, he says, that is to say, any one of the citizens, taken singly, is perhaps inferior in comparison to the best. But the city is made up of many persons, just as a feast to which many contribute is finer, is better, than a single and simple one, and on this account, a crowd also judges many matters better than a single person. Furthermore, what is many, he says, is more incorruptible. Like a greater amount of water, the many is more incorruptible than the few.